I really loved the kōrero. One of the things I heard at the Ngāti Maru signing when they did their settlement a couple of weeks ago. They were interviewed on Wātea, and she said it was about, for them as an iwi, it was about moving from treaty settlement to treaty honouring actions. And I think as like I'm hearing from your kōrero is for the Methodists, that's where you've fundamentally been sitting, as your church is heading in that treaty, te treaty honouring actions. Would that be a really fair statement? Because I don't see, to be honest, as the rest of the body of Christ is not even functioning in that manner at all, as operating as te treaty partners.
Tēnā koe mo te pātai. English. Okay. We, in the Methodist Church since 1983, when the bicultural journey was established, straight away we started having what we called power sharing workshops, because our people didn't know how to talk about this. They didn't know how to talk about te tiriti. They didn't know how to relate te tiriti to anything within the context of the church. So there was a lot of education that went on, probably right into the late 1990s. So it's taken us a little while, but we have these processes that we use in terms of decision making, because that was the big part. Because our people were always going to be a minority in our hāhi, we needed a mechanism for us to be able to participate effectively in the decision-making of the church. And so we developed this understanding of consensus decision-making, which allowed for Te Taha Māori, our Māori division of the church, and Tauiwi, which is basically everybody else, to have effectively equal decision-making abilities. And so that's always been our practice, and not just at our conference level, but on boards and committees where they are making decisions about the life of our church. This comes into play. And our bicultural practice is based on elements from Te Tiriti o Waitangi. That had to be one of those fundamental, he whāriki noiho kia tātou. Sorry, I keep... Sometimes it's better to explain in Māori. He whāriki pai kia tātou, hei tūkahai, I roti tā tātou nei rangatiratanga, me o tātou nei mana motuhake. So it enabled us to be able to work together, but it took a lot of work. And the likes of Agurua Rākena, they were at the forefront of developing some of these processes and ways forward. But it seems to have kind of held up. It's like anything, though, you have to maintain it. It doesn't just happen. You have to continuously teach new generations about why this is important and why we engage in this way.
To stop the walls getting continually built over and over again. It's beautiful. I haven't heard of that. Sorry, I'm tāmati no te hapua rau ko whamaruru rau ko rangariri.
Okay. Tēnā rau atu. So.
Yes. I have a question, Paul. I really think the way you laid out Cook stuff is really, really helpful. That's really important, and you did that really well. I'm just thinking, when in 1877, Prendergast issues the decision, where he says, he doesn't say just that the treaty is a simple nullity. He says it's a simple nullity because Māori did not have the legal system or capacity to enter into a treaty. I want to add on Prendergast's behalf, because this is often said. He then goes on to say that there might be a moral responsibility on the Crown to honour what was said in the treaty, but it's not a legal responsibility. So my question is this: is he imposing retrospectively the Doctrine of Discovery on New Zealand before 1840? And if he does so, because that becomes legal doctrine for a long time, you could argue until Ned's mum in 2002 does the foreshore and seabed decision, which, undermines that 90 Mile Beach decision, which is based still on Prendergast, that in a sense discovery may not be there in the historical past, but it's retrospectively imposed by Prendergast.
Yes. Well, no, there's a bit more to it than that. I think you're right.
Something I've thought about before.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, and I think he was disingenuous in making that claim because clearly in 1839 the view of the British government was that the rangatira did have capacity to conclude a treaty. You don't give instructions for free intelligent consent if you believe the signatories don't have the capacity to give free and intelligent consent. So it's a bit late in the day in 1877 to turn around and go, well, actually they didn't, and I think you're right.
There's a lot of law that happens after 1877.
I guess the other thing is that the talk here, nationally, is the treaty, but under United Nations law, it's te treaty that we have to stand aside. But continually, we hear the treaty from everyone, and under United Nations law, the one that's written in the Indigenous tongue is the one that stands. Is that wrong or right?
Yeah, right.
So why does everybody talk about the treaty? Because there wasn't many signatories at the bottom of it. They were all on te treaty, the majority.
I've got to be careful what I say here, not upset too many people. But I think that principle's taken from principles applied, and hopefully lawyers will correct me on this, applied in contract law, where there's differences in interpretations, say in translations between contracts. The one that works against the drafter of the contract is the one that takes precedent, and that seems to have jumped the fence, and it's applied to treaties. It's applied retrospectively because in the 1840s there was barely any international law to speak of. John Stuart Mill wrote about this afterwards. He complained that international law was more like international anarchy. So there's the risk of applying more recent ideas to something that was signed before those ideas were in place. I think the other thing too, and I'm not disagreeing with that principle, I think it's worthwhile considering that, I think Ned epitomises this, that we're reaching a point where there's a great deal of consistency between the versions rather than the conflict that informed the discussion in earlier years. And there are issues raised with that, of course. So do we stick with the 1840 understanding, or do we accept that there are problems with originalist interpretations of documents like the United States Constitution? There's a lot of good literature written by American legal scholars about the problem of interpreting documents as they were intended at the time, because society changes. And I think the Waitangi Tribunal, with its development principles, addressed that and said that we have to accept that the treaty has to evolve to take into account changes in society and technology since it was signed. So things like radio frequencies, for example, which aren't mentioned in the treaty, can become the basis of a claim because things evolved since then. So yes, it's a complex area.
Just to add, there is dicta in the United States Supreme Court in the late 20s, 1830s about the Cherokee cases and the like, which sort of says, if there's a contradiction between the two cases, then it's the native language one that will prevail. So that was available at the time by things like the 1847 case on current science, where they refer to those cases.
Yes, this question addressed to Paul. Paul, I have always associated the doctrine of discovery with terra nullius. But you didn't mention terra nullius.
No, because the Catholic Church brushed over that. They were quite happy about the fact that there were people living in these areas. They didn't regard them as vacant or unoccupied or people not having title to them if they lived there. They simply overrode that and said, well, on the basis that they're not Catholic,
But if you take the usage in the early 19th century and in, say, the annexation of Australia, the fundamental doctrine seems to be terra nullius, I think.
That's the argument, but there are different applications of it, I think. Certainly, if we go back to 1493, the view of the Vatican was this is a territory that has some potential material value. That's going to lead to problems between Spain and Portugal. We will delineate who has access to what parts of this territory. It involves claiming the sovereignty over the people, subjugating them, and claiming effectively ownership, however we define that, over the land. That wasn't applied in New Zealand.
What was applied here, though, was when they tried to apply in Parliament, they tried to bring the act in of theory of evolution, saying that we as Māori weren't. They tried to bring it in. There was debate in the House about bringing in the Darwin's thing about the survival of the fittest, and we Māori weren't of a capacity to operate at the same level of Pākehā, but it wasn't enacted, but it was debated in our House. So there was that functionality of thinking here around the survival of the fittest.
I think you see that at the end of the 19th century, that social Darwinism that Newman in 1889 in Parliament said effectively it's going to be terrible when the Maori race disappears, but it'll be good essentially for two reasons, I'm paraphrasing, because New Zealand will be all white and we won't have to deal with them anymore. And that was his view. And you can see that sort of very evil strain of social Darwinism coming through in that. Our job is not to save the Maori race, but to smooth the pillow of the dying race, that sort of thing. There's a real sentiment that, this is how nature ordained things. In the natural world, the superior race, and this is the language that's used, the superior race triumphs over the inferior race. And towards the end of the 19th century, that sort of talk becomes quite prominent.
Yeah, kia ora, thank you both for your presentations. It's really interesting, the crossover between the state and the church. With the your quoted or call about the papal bull and delivering essentially what you would ascribe to a political context. But my thing about church and state, and again, it's kind of with my traditional lens on, and I make no bones about the fact that I'm here because I want to be refreshed, by the intellectual and academic discourse that is being offered at this one, and that's coming through for me. But my question really is around what can, if anything, the state can learn from the church about relationships and consensus decision making. So I guess, I look at the Anglican Church with its 3 pillars, and now I didn't realise that the Wesleyan Church, they had this bicultural focus. I'm not sure what the Presbyterians are doing. I'm Catholic myself, and there's not much happening really in that space in terms of that kind of distinction. But is there something in what the churches are doing around this whole thing of that relationship and that treaty relationship that can be learned or transferred to the state environment to assist with
I think I got the short straw. But I think the vision really came from the people, and I think that's been our success, that our people worked really, really hard to get into a room together and just hammer it out. It wasn't good. It was really, really painful. But they were prepared to have those really difficult, confronting conversations. And even now, those who were there at the time, I wasn't there. But my parents were a part of those early power sharing workshops. And they would come home exhausted and mamai because they had to give a part of themselves that required that kind of commitment. It's like anything. If you really, really want a relationship to work, you have to put the effort in. And I believe that that's what those early members of our hāhi did. Māori and Pākehā, we have records of some of the conversations that went on. They were shocking. You'd never be allowed to talk like that to one another in a hāhi today. There's some osh or something or other. But just simply to say, I think there's definitely some lessons to be learnt, and not just from our hāhi. There are hāhi around the world doing some fantastic stuff around reconciliation, and they've been doing it for years. What we are doing is something that fit perfectly for us. I think it has a lot to do with our Methodist ethos. So I think some of that is probably what has kind of been built into our own bicultural journey. And we called it a journey because it's never ending. You're constantly having to maintain this relationship. Like for you fellas who are married, you got to keep at it, right? Date nights, everything else. We got to do the same with our bicultural journey. Again and again and again. It's that, like Jury said, you have to be committed to an enduring peace. Not a part-time peace, not a just for this year peace, but constant, enduring. You've got to be ready for the long haul. But I do think there are things that we could, whether they would listen or not, maybe if our whanaunga, Penny and Shane, if we had a word in there, maybe.
Send them out to see them.
But they don't come to hāhi, so...
Can I ask one other question? It's probably a very obvious question, obvious answer, but from a perspective of you guys as like the missionaries who the forebearer of pretty much every church in the country in Te Tiriti, does that make the body of Christ, like every collective church, a treaty partner? Or we observers?
I don't know that sorry. Do you want to take this one?
I'm sorry, what we
I don't know that it makes everybody a partner, but it definitely makes everybody a part of the body.
So the body was, as Whakapapa Matters in the word, right? You got numbers, and it's Whakapapa right the way through.
Yeah.
So why doesn't it matter to the church? Because every one of our churches here has a whakapapa back to the day in 1840 where we were given freedom to practice religion, to practice our faith. Why does that not then make us a treaty partner and give us the accountability? Like with Alistair leading his stuff down in Tauranga Moana. But that was an apology. That went through 50 sets of hands. A lawyer that was like, I read it and wanted to throw up.
Yeah.
You know, it was everything but accountability. You know, so the church dodges and we have, you know, a $300 million endowment in one church and hundreds of millions of dollars sitting there off our asset, and yet we put our hands up and say, whakapapa doesn't matter. It's like we don't read the word, because Numbers says our whakapapa, as the body of Christ, goes back to that bit of paper that gives us the right to practice.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm probably making a statement more than a question.
Whai noiho kia au. I think you're right in a sense that every hāhi that has engaged in the life of Aotearoa has a solemn commitment to make. Whether they know that or not, whether they're prepared to do that or not is another story. You will understand that Te Akapuaho made a statement, I don't know if it was last year or early this year, about the return of land. We have been in what we call a process of land stories from Mairano in Te Hāhiwetiriana, where we have to. Any synod, any parish wanting to sell a church, a property, must do what we call a land story. So they have to trace the whakapapa of that land back to the original owners. And if it is known in that research that that land was part of Raupatu, me era atu mea katoa, the land must go back. And the church takes responsibility for compensating that parish for their loss. But it's a costly way of doing things, but it's an accountability that we are committed to.
I wish every church had that kaupapa, because people ask me the question, I say burn them all to the ground so that people figure out that it's not about the food, it's about the people.
I mean, in an ideal world, that would be right. I don't know about the mihinari. I can only speak for my hāhi.
That's a great question and answer. Alistair, you had a question?
Do we have time?
Yep.
Yeah, tēnā koro. Thanks for your you're speaking to us today. I see a theologian and a historian, and so the question is for both of you related to Paul's really very clear illumination around the doctrine of discovery. My lens, and I see your lens, Te Arawa, is through a lens of reconciliation. And I just wonder whether the responsibility of an historian and the responsibility of a theologian are different, whereas sometimes sheer facts around an issue don't actually always go to what a reconciler might consider the heart of the matter, so that an offended party might be inaccurate or exaggerate, perhaps even in some sense, the offence. And the offender can correct, even truthfully, but I wonder if reconciliation is the goal, and it might not be the goal of an historian, but if reconciliation is the goal, what place does accurate history play in that relationship? How does that?
I've got quite a narrow view about that, in that I don't think it is the role of historians to be involved actively in trying to seek reconciliation, partly because it strays away from the discipline, partly because it presumes there's an absolute definition of what constitutes reconciliation or what that will look like, and that's always going to be contested anyway. So that's entering into a game you can't win. And then, of course, after that, you become a bit more influenced by ideology, or you try to reshape the evidence to fit certain approaches. There are people who believe that's the purpose of it. There's one writer who said that the purpose of history is to achieve social justice. I don't think that's the case, partly because I don't think you can adequately describe what social justice is, and even if you could, it's a moving feast, and then even if you settle that down, it's really not the role of a historian to do that, because that becomes a propaganda function, even if the cause is valid. So the other thing too, of course, hopefully, if you get enough of the truth, or what remains of it, as John Stuart Mill said, then you can base decisions and feelings and things on that evidence, that the truth liberates you. Truth sets you free, effectively. And no amount of trying to go for social justice will compensate for the evidence, I don't think. And that sounds a bit cynical and a bit clinical, but in the absence of evidence, what have you got?
Yeah, that sounded good to me. Sorry. I just quickly wanted to respond to Alistair. I'm not a theologian. I'm just a Māori, a practitioner of mātauranga Māori, which happens to include talking about God. Because in my experience, people who call themselves theologians, there's lots of expectations on you if you put that label on. So just for me, I'm a practitioner of mātauranga Māori, and that sometimes means talking about God. I think that history can be used as a mechanism and as a tool for engaging in conversations around reconciliation. And perhaps that's where our two divides might meet. Yeah.
One last one very quickly.
Yeah, again, thank you very much to RI and Paul for speaking today. And maybe just the conversation here, where I found it distinctive was just your mention of the presence of God being in the treaty. You know, a historian wouldn't normally tell you that, but someone from your perspective would, and actually brings another dimension to that conversation and responsibility as followers of Christ, and what we perhaps need to contribute towards honouring that treaty. But my just observation was really good in terms of Paul speaking to the Doctrine of Discovery, and sort of, again, both you emphasising the role of the treaty, and emphasising the treaty in different ways to New Zealand's relations and constitutional position. But how do you respond to the comments you often hear, and I've heard these within Māoridom and within certain Māori leaders around the dismissiveness of the treaty and sort of this view of they're quite in favour of a republic, and where the Crown isn't involved at all. And so then on what grounds are they looking to argue that? And I'm sort of also going back to international law and then thinking about, its discovery or its treaty or its annexation or its terra nullius, they can claim rights to land. But under a republic, how does that work? And how does that sort of, what's the Māori thinking around that and their sort of claims to sort of leadership or rights in New Zealand under a republic model?
Just a moment.
I don't know. But seriously, I come from Ngāpuhi. Nobody's talking about being a republic in the whole of the north of the Harbour Bridge. So we aren't necessarily having those conversations. The circles that I move in aren't having those conversations. And I think part of it is because we have te tiriti so ingrained in who we are as Māori, as Hāhi. So I don't know that I can even answer your question, aroha mai. I hazard a guess, but that's not going to be helpful. Maybe we korero tahi tāua muri ake. Sorry, we can speak later. Yeah.
30 seconds. Not really. This relates to an episode about 6 years ago where someone from Ngāpuhi who was near retirement age decided he wanted a British pension. And so he and I went to the British consulate and he argued under Article 3 that he was entitled to the same rights and privileges as British subjects. And I pointed out to him in advance that it would not be successful, and it wasn't. But he did it just to make the point. And the point is that there are effectively two crowns. There's the Crown and the Crown in New Zealand. And we can perhaps get caught up on names, but in practice, we effectively act without any British involvement or agency in the treaty whatsoever now. And that means that if we change heads of state or whatever else, I don't think materially that would make a difference, but it might symbolically, and that's important for some people. So